Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, a novel by Ocean Vuong. So Ocean Vuong is a really amazing poet. He has one poetry collection out, and then he wrote this very poetic leaning novel. So the book's protagonist is a boy that is called Little Dog, which is the nickname given to him by his grandma and how he is referred to throughout the book. And in the book, Little Dog is writing a letter to his mother and, telling the story of his childhood from his own perspective. So Little Dog and his family are immigrants from Vietnam. So he comes to America when he is 2 years old. He lives with his grandmother and his mother there. So his grandmother and his mother were living in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and saw horrible things while they were there. And even after the war was over, the country had so many problems as a result of the war. And the year they left, I think in the book it said it was 13 years after the war had ended, but the country was still so damaged at that point. So they end up in Hartford, and we see Little Dog's experience growing up there and sort of the xenophobia issues and the language barrier issues and the poverty. And I think we also see a lot of love for Hartford and the diverse people there just in the descriptions alone. And then what makes up sort of the latter portion of this book is Little Dog's relationship with Trevor, who is his first love. So a question I certainly had when I was starting this book is how much of it is fact or fiction. Clearly, Ocean Vuong is taking a lot of inspiration from his own life and his own family history. So I did look this up, and I found in an interview Ocean Vuong talking about this, how a lot of what happens in this book does start with his own real experiences, but it doesn't always end up that way. He takes the story where the story's going, whether it's true to his own life or not. And that's why this is considered a novel, but just a novel that's heavily inspired by his own experiences. And he notes this too, that I really think that's a poet's way of thinking about what the truth is, that you're trying to get at a greater truth, more so than a literal truth. So while I think Ocean Vuong is certainly writing about things he knows, I wouldn't take this for a memoir because we don't really know where those lines are. Just like how in poetry, often the voice is very similar to the writer, but the speaker in a poem is not necessarily equivalent. So there's a lot of discussion in this book about people themselves being the products of violence. They wouldn't be in America if the Vietnam War hadn't happened. Little Dog wouldn't even exist if the war hadn't happened. So his grandmother, Lan, she sort of walked out on a marriage in Vietnam, and being sort of unattachable at that point, had to become a sex worker in order to survive. And so Little Dog's mother, who often goes by Rose in this book, or is called Rose, she is the daughter of an American soldier. So the war in general is the only way that she exists. And, Ocean Vuong makes a parallel between that and Tiger Woods and how he is also a product of the Vietnam War if you look at his family history and ethnic background. So all of this violence is kind of an inherent part of their history. And even though Little Dog was only 2 years old when he leaves Vietnam, he is inheriting a lot of this trauma. And then very early in the book, there's this metaphor introduced about monarch butterflies. And, you know, obviously they migrate, so it's not such a jump to make the immigration connection. But really, I think what it narrows in on is that monarch butterflies leave home, but that same generation isn't going to come back. It's their children that will go back. So a monarch flying south, they won't live long enough to make the trip back. And that seems to me to connect well to his grandmother Lan's story, in that Vietnam is her home. She has to leave it, and she doesn't ever really get to go back. It's like early in the video to be talking about something that happens at the end, but we do see Lan pass away at the end of the book, and the last thing she asks for is to eat some rice from the district where she is from in Vietnam. So her life ends in this kind of foreign place, and I mean, the metaphor is very poignant. It's a very sad scene, of course. And the point is made over and over again in this book, and it's one that I've tried to explore in my own writing and in my own worldview, is that these characters are not just their trauma. They are not just this darkness and violence that's in their past. So Little Dog, in his thoughts by the end of the book, he's really pushing back against the idea that they are products of violence, but they are products of beauty, and the beauty in surviving those things and coming out relatively unharmed. So we see beauty talked about so much in this book. I mean, you know, the title, obviously it's going to come up, and there's so much about the appreciation of beauty and these kind of little moments of joy along the way throughout the book. Like in an early example, we see the names being a reflection of this. Lan names herself, and her name means orchid, and she names her daughter Rose. She usually goes by Rose in this book, but her actual name is the Vietnamese word for rose, which I think was Hong. So they both get these beautiful floral names, and they were specifically chosen. Lan was seeking out beauty in her difficult life. And then we also see the point being made that they don't have the language for a lot of the beautiful things they see. At least they don't have the English language for it, but they can still appreciate it. You know, you don't have to be particularly educated to feel beauty and to have that depth within you, which sounds obvious when you say it, but I think when we're seeing things in movies and TV of people being reduced to stereotypes, we take away people's ability to appreciate things like that. So like there's a scene about the hummingbirds, like they don't even know the word for hummingbird, and at that age I don't think Little Dog does either, but they know it's beautiful and they know that they want the hummingbirds to come to their yard too. And then there's a similar thing with flowers, like Little Dog and his grandmother like stealing flowers from the side of a highway just because they're beautiful, and they don't need the name for it. They know that it's beautiful. So they're not just trauma. It's not just hardship. They, like everyone, seek out beauty and little moments of joy in their life. And that's one of the most important things in this book, is that balance, that even if you have a hard life, that's not all you are. You can't just be reduced to that. And that happiness and sadness often exist right alongside each other. And there is so much love in this book. You know, in the protagonist and Little Dog, he has so much love for his mother and his grandmother, and Trevor, once we meet Trevor. And that love coincides with abuse and challenges all throughout the book. So something that's very important and comes up a lot in this book is the role of language and the language barrier that Little Dog's family members experience when they're in Hartford. So his mother, Rose, knows very little English, and she doesn't seem to be literate either. Her education in Vietnam was interrupted because of the war. So she can't read, which is very significant for Little Dog because as he grows up, he eventually becomes a writer. And we see scenes where she has trouble communicating with English speakers, and there's a lot of sort of xenophobia and hate that she gets because of that. There's an interesting moment where it talks about how they go to a store and Rose, her father was a white American man. She almost passes at first as a white woman, but then when she has to speak, that goes away. And it's clearly something that's very painful for her and that she feels a lot of shame about. And you can see early on that Little Dog wants to learn English and be a translator and sort of protect his mom from having to feel that kind of shame. And the language really speaks to the act of writing this book altogether. Remember, it's written as a letter to his mother, but the essential irony is that his mother won't be able to read it. I think we see as the book goes on, there's a lot that's unsaid between Little Dog and his mother, and this is kind of the way to say it. And then towards the end of the book, there's this one kind of beautiful, heartbreaking little moment where Little Dog is sort of saying his final wish for his mother, and that he hopes that when she dies and is reincarnated, that she will be a little girl in a house full of books, and that maybe one day that girl will read this book that Little Dog is writing, will find this letter, and will remember him. So there's so much about language in this book and sort of reflecting on how language affects how we think and how we see things too. So now let's get into talking about Trevor. So Trevor is a very American boy that Little Dog meets while working summers on a tobacco farm. And Trevor ends up being his first love. And there's so many beautiful little scenes and moments with them where you can see them falling for each other and like finding some solace in that. And there's some talk about how Little Dog kind of learns how to live more fully when he's with Trevor. So it's all very sweet, and I think early on we're brought into the charm of Trevor, and we understand what Little Dog sees in him very quickly because the story gives us all of those happy moments first. But we also see that Trevor is, an American boy, was obviously raised with very traditional ideas about masculinity. So that obviously causes some internalized shame and conflict with him having a gay relationship with Little Dog. And then as the book goes on, we see more and more pieces of this very dark, tragic part of Trevor's life, in that he is an addict. So eventually we find out that due to an injury when he was 15, I believe, he was prescribed opioids and became addicted to them, and that addiction led to the use of a lot of different drugs. And really the whole time Little Dog knows him, Trevor is struggling with this. And then at the end of the book, Trevor dies from an overdose, and he's only 22 years old. So the opioid crisis is another thing that this book is really taking a hard look at. There's mention of several people Little Dog knows in this community who have overdosed. And I think anyone from a rural community or, you know, a less affluent community in America knows how widespread this issue is. So, I mean, a lot of those scenes and the way that the writer addresses that really hits close to home. So a theme that comes up a lot in this book is traditional masculinity. Obviously, it comes up with Trevor a lot. There's discussion throughout about sort of assigning traditional gender roles to Little Dog and Trevor, and that somehow makes Trevor feel more comfortable. And then there's just a lot of talk about people sort of trying to toughen Little Dog up, and Little Dog not being enough of like a man. There's this whole scene about Little Dog getting a pink bike when he's a kid, and it just being, you know, the one that his mom could afford, and then he gets bullied for it. But Little Dog himself, even after that, he loves his pink bike. You know, he doesn't want to be attacked. He doesn't want to call attention to himself, but privately he likes his pink bike, and it doesn't really matter to him that it's pink. So we see lots of things like that, of Little Dog just being who he is, clashing with kind of the American values of masculinity. So I want to talk a little bit about how trauma plays out in the lives of the characters in this book. You know, trauma from the war and trauma from being abused, and how that affects how they act in their day-to-day lives. So both Lon and Rose had really difficult experiences when they were in Vietnam. They're carrying a lot of trauma from that. The civilians in Vietnam suffered a lot and saw a lot of death and loss. So both Lon and Rose throughout the book are having these mental health issues and are having these PTSD symptoms. And that makes for a lot of the like truly heartbreaking scenes in this book. You know, there's a part about, you know, fireworks and that kind of triggering something in Lon and sending her into this kind of survival mode. And there is this whole scene where Little Dog's mother, Rose, is convinced that she has to go and save her sister from her abusive husband, but in reality she's just kind of reliving something that happened years ago. And we're seeing this all through the lens of a little boy who I think feels like he wants to take care of them. Remember, there's all this love in the story, but there's a lot of darkness going on as well. So very early in the book, it's established that Little Dog loves his mother, and they have all these beautiful little moments together, but those moments are directly contrasted with these moments of abuse. You know, Rose herself was abused by Little Dog's father, and we see like a whole list of instances where she hit Little Dog. But obviously nothing is so simple that Little Dog can only feel one way about his mother. So really we see in, you know, how they're living and how they're getting by with all of this, that survival isn't just existing, but that just the act of existing is a challenge. I mean, they're really fighting every day. And I think this trauma that sometimes causes Rose to kind of shut down is another one of those little barriers between Little Dog and his mother that the act of writing this book is kind of trying to break through. So Little Dog obviously sees all of the pain in his mother, and he wants to shield her from a lot. You know, there seems to be so much about Trevor in particular that is left unsaid between him and his mother. He doesn't want to make her life more difficult. So then Little Dog speaking through this letter, through this book, is him you know, finally giving her this whole story that is both beautiful and sad. So I really want to highlight the way this book is written, the style that it's written in, because it really is such a poet's novel. And I love seeing poets writing outside of the genre and writing things in prose, because I think they tend to bring something really unique to it and something that appeals to me and my taste as a reader. So there's a lot of poetic elements to how this is written. You know, we're seeing sort of vignettes a lot in this book, little short scenes and glimpses. Things aren't necessarily in chronological order. It tends to break a lot of the rules that you would expect from a novel. We also see these metaphors created and developed throughout the book, like the monarch butterflies, for instance. And the way those metaphors are introduced and developed and explored feels very poetic to me. And even in the structure, there are some parts of this book that feel very explicitly like a prose poem to me. Like if you look at this section, which kind of takes on a list structure, where it's talking about sort of different features of Trevor and giving us some background. You know, the structure does not look like traditional prose. It's a little genre bending. You know, there's no need for complete sentences or following rules like that, which feels very much more like poetry than prose. And I mean, it's just, the language is so rich and beautiful and is just like chock full of all of this great imagery. So clearly a lot of those poetic skills, which Ocean Vuong has, you know, tons of. He is an amazing poet. All of that is finding its way into this novel, which I think leads to a really unique voice and something that's really engaging and beautiful. I mean, there's such a love for language, and it's explicitly talked about, the love for language, but it's also just in every word choice and every sentence. It's so obvious that the writer loves this medium that they're working with. So yes, there's a lot of trauma in this book. There's a lot of hard and sad things that these characters are dealing with, but there's so much more to the story than that. I mean, there's so much love and there's beauty. I mean, just the title itself really reflects this. And that makes the moments, you know, all the more moving and poignant as a reader. I mean, the final 50 pages or so were just like so emotionally resonant, and it wasn't just because it was sad with like no payoff, right? There's really complicated human emotions being portrayed here, and it feels so natural. I'll read this, which is one of the quotes I wrote down of Little Dog's own thoughts on this subject. Do you remember the happiest day of your life? What about the saddest? Do you ever wonder if sadness and happiness can be combined to make a deep purple feeling? Not good, not bad, but remarkable simply because you didn't have to live on one side or the other. And that really is one of the central themes of this book, that you don't have to live on one side or the other. And I think in that, and, you know, reckoning with this past with his family, in dealing with the loss of Trevor, the love and the loss of Trevor, I think Little Dog really gains this appreciation for just living. So I want to read one more thing on that note before I'm wrapping up the video. I want to insist that our being alive is beautiful enough to be worthy of replication. And so what? So what if all I ever made of my life was more of it? So in so many ways, this book becomes a celebration of life and survival. And I think we have to note that the last line of this book ends with laughter. So, I mean, I knew already going into this that I was going to love this book, but it was so much more than I even expected. It is so beautifully written. It's so moving. It's a great story. It's surprising in form and content. I mean, it comes with a very big recommendation from me. This is such an amazing book. I have read the poetry collection by Ocean Vuong before. I hope to revisit it soon and make a video about it because, I mean, he is such a talented person. It's completely mind-blowing how he can use language, and everything just turns out so beautiful and surprising, and he feels like such a fresh voice right now in poetry. Anyways, so my next video will be about some poetry. It's Day Being Gone by Rose McClarney. And yeah, that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.